Hello students, welcome to class with Professor Mead. Today we're going to be talking about African Americans and the birth of the modern American marriage. This article was written by Donna Franklin. So this is our think, pair, share for today. We want to see where we stand, right? So what's revolutionary about marriage in the late 1800s? How did freedom from slavery enable blacks to capitalize on marriage, family, and church? How did the women's club movement help black women? Significant cultural differences regarding marriage resulted in the differences in professional success between black and white women. Why and how did this happen? And how has pay changed for black women versus white women over time? I would like you to take a second and try to write down these answers prior to the lecture to see what you know. This is our second Think, Pair, Share. You can find the answers to these in the supplementary video that I wrote for this article, that I posted for this article. These are some terms that you should know either from Intro to Sociology, or they're connected in a variety of ways. Usually they're learned through Sociology of Family, so in a class like this. Marriage squeeze would be one of those. Exchange theory, which is an economic theory. And how does that apply to black women today? Okay, so first let's talk about what was revolutionary about marriages for black women in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So looking first at the macro level statistics, 85% of black female activists were married, while only about 34% of white female activists were married. A good example of this is Ida B. Wells and Alice Freeman. There's a letter between the two of them in the article where they talk about the double duty of being both a wife, mom, and a political activist working, and how that pulls you in two different directions. Ida B. Wells had what we call a sympathetic husband. They were both professionals when they got married, and he never expected her to do the domestic work for him, to become the domestic wife for him. So when he married her, and they started having children, she continued to try to be a political activist. She did retire for about 5 months, but then she ended up returning to work. But the entire time she had the support and companionship of her husband. They were intellectual equals and they treated each other as so. They had additional domestic help. She even had a nursemaid to tour with her when she was making political speeches and when she was working. Alice Freeman, she became the first president of Wellesley College, but she goes on to that other perspective. You can kind of see the difference, right? So while she was the first female president of a college, of Wellesley College, the day she announced her engagement to one of the professors, she resigned. So for many white Americans, what we see, white women in this time, what we see is that college and an education prepare you to find a husband, not to lead a career or to further your intellectual labor. Free at last section, right? So this talks about freed slaves and how they used rights that were previously denied to them, such as being able to get married, being able to meet with family and friends and with their churches in a non-secretive way. And what this means is that they were able to build what we call social capital. So prior to this, because they were not allowed to congregate for religious reasons or for family gatherings, the connection that you make within, say, church, synagogue, within your family, within your community, allows you to access those resources and helps you build social capital. So you have a huge increase in access to social capital for freed slaves just after they become freed. And they very much welcomed and utilized the opportunity to freely socialize, which allowed them to create those connections and to link those resources, things that were previously denied to them. The women's club movement gave Black women a platform. You see this emergence of Black female leaders. You see, for example, the first conference of Negro women led by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. And she's the one that launched the National Association of Colored Women, known as the NACW. And what this allowed them to do was have a voice. They gave them a platform for Black women's social concerns. It gave them a voice and a platform from which to speak. This is huge at this time. And you could see how through both social capital, hard work, intellectual labor, those connections, they're able to move forward economically rather quickly through being able to link these resources that we often don't think about ourselves even today. One of the things that they also did was that they kind of had a sense of deference to the men's plight, and so they tried to minimize the confrontations between gaining men's rights for Black men and women's rights for Black men, because these are women's rights for Black women, because these are not necessarily linked, right? As we know, Black men were offered awarded the right to vote before even white women, because in our culture still, women were not considered full citizens, and even if they did vote, it was perceived that it was just the husband's vote doubled, right? That women didn't think for themselves. And the difference between the Black women's movement and the white women's movement that comes later is that the Black women's movement had this sense of lift as we climb, which means they were trying to pull up the entire Black community. There was recognized sympathy towards their husbands, brothers, and fathers, and they were all trying to pull themselves up together. This kind of leads us to this Black women's era, right? The effort to improve an education for Black women was actually a very successful women's era, because you have almost no professional class of Black men and women prior to the 1900s. You see a huge increase, 219% increase in professional Black women between 1890 and 1910. That's just 20 years. By 1910, 43% of Black professionals were women. Female graduates outnumbered male graduates, and most of these women became teachers and leaders within academia, mostly because that was the only option provided to them that was not domestic work. And Black women and men, even through today, have avoided domestic work and farm work or farm labor because of its connection to continued oppression during slavery. So you see the community as a whole, even through today, has pulled themselves away and doesn't want to be connected with that type of work. It moved into work that Hispanic and other women of color adopted that didn't have that connection to slavery prior to, but it still resulted in a form of oppression, continued oppression for women of color today, especially Hispanic women. So what kind of things encourage this, right? Well, prior to the 1900s, Black women already worked outside of the home. Women of color in general always worked outside of the home. It was only white women who did not have to work outside the home. So the women's era and the women's movement for women of color is quite distinct than the women's movement for white women, because they weren't fighting for the right to go to work, to have their own jobs. They were fighting for the right to have equality in marriage and life and intellectual pursuits, a platform to speak, those types of things. Almost 60, 70 years before white women took up the women's movement, what we often think of as the sexual revolution and the women's revolution of the 1960s. So what are some of the kind of differences when we compare here? We see quite different values, norms, and mores through our society um, in that time and that have continued forward. So that's what really had led to the divergent experiences between Black and white women. Starting with the norm and the value of intelligence and femininity. Intelligence and femininity for the Black community does not conflict, and even today it doesn't. But for the white community, there's an idea of intelligence and femininity as conflicting. You can't be both feminine and intelligent as a woman. It's one or the other. So to increase your power and intellectual prowess is to lose femininity, where within the Black community, it's not seen in the same light. But we do see that value imposed on the Black community when we talk about how Black women are viewed. They're too aggressive, they're too masculine, they're taking over the patriarchal role of the father, right? Now, not mentioned in the article, but something to point out. Black women and women of color, but especially Black women, have always been the economic center of their families, because Black men have always had a much more difficult time entering the economy, because Black men are feared, especially just after slavery. Black men are extremely feared, whereas Black women are not necessarily feared. So they're given the jobs or given the opportunities that Black men have historically and still today being blocked from. They're also not pursued in the same way, to a lesser extent, in terms of violence, policing, and incarceration. So what happened was, in the early 1900s through to the 1960s, this allowed for Black women to experience much greater upward mobility than white women did at the same time. You have a 90% of the middle upper class in the Black community came from working class backgrounds. They were able to move up in their social class standing through academia, through their intellectual labor, and moving into more prestigious types of jobs. Whereas you only see about 35% of middle upper class white women come from working class backgrounds in the same time. And one of the values or the norms historically that made that difference was the idea of what is marriage. So even in the early 1900s, Black women had much larger, much greater marriage equality, whereas white women were still practicing a form of what we call traditional marriage. It still was kind of akin to property marriage. And the norm or the value was that, you don't work and have a spouse at the same time. So you didn't have that companionship marriage. You had more of what we call property marriage, what you might call, or what was moving into a traditional marriage. Just to let you know, traditional marriages, this idea of the trade, right? The theory of the economic exchange, that only lasted for about 10 years. Property marriages, that's the type of marriage where it's the idea that the father and the husband owns essentially their children and their family, and therefore are responsible for them, right? And anybody within the household, that's a property marriage, right? Those have been around for thousands and thousands of years. Now they tend to have lower divorce rates, but also higher abuse rates. People also actually report fairly high satisfaction with property marriages when they come from a culture that has that type of marriage. And so I want you to just be careful. I mentioned this because I want you to be careful about your own preconceived notions. As a modern American today, you're going to see the companionship marriage, the more modern style of marriage, as the better marriage. A lot of times, but just be cautious, because there's always positives and negatives to any type of concept, whether it's modern or antiquated, and that includes the companionship marriage versus these property marriages. So what are some of the changes that we see over time in African American marriages? These are the social and cultural forces. This one's more on the macro level, right? Where you have the women's movement becoming a catalyst, not just for Black women, but it moves into the public sphere as a catalyst for white women to move forward into their women's movement. So from 1975 to 2000, after the white women's movement, the sexual revolution and sex equality, from the 1960s on, white women's income and median income grew by 32%, but Black women's median income only grew by 22%, and that continues to decline. If you look at the statistics, the highest earners tend to be white women, then Asian women, then Black women, and then Hispanic women at the bottom. And so what has essentially occurred, right, the social and cultural forces have divergent effects on women's group based on their color, based on their racial background, meaning that it was more beneficial for white women than it was for Black women. And at this time as well, Black women began to experience what we call the marriage squeeze, right? So because Black women have continued to be more and more educated, they do get college educations at a higher rate than Black men. They tend to go into public jobs that are secure and provide, retirement and that kind of thing. They began to experience a smaller and smaller pool of available marriageable partners. In addition to some of the other variables that impact this, both Black and white men, all men who have higher education and higher salaries, still tend to prefer to marry women who are not what we call, very old religious term, equally yoked, right? So they still are likely to marry a woman who does not necessarily have a higher education or does not make a lot of money. Whereas the reverse in that, when you see a flip in that, a woman who has a much higher education level or makes a lot more money than her spouse, that causes severe anxiety and identity crisis for the male within the relationship, and therefore often causes marital problems and divorce, because our society says that men are supposed to be a little bit more, right? A little bit taller, make a little bit more money, have a little bit more education. And so when men enter into a relationship with a spouse where they're not at least a little bit more in those scenarios, it takes a really strong foundation for that person, right? It takes them to have a really strong sense of self to be able to resist the negative pressures from society and be in their relationship in a loving way and still feel equal. Okay. So, as we mentioned in the supplementary video, the lecture has contributed to my learning. So you can kind of review some of these. What's a revolutionary marriage, right? Can you now answer that? How did freedom from slavery enable Blacks to capitalize on marriage, family, and church? How did the club women's movement help Black women? What are some significant cultural differences regarding marriage that resulted in professional success between Black and white women? Success differences is really what that should say, between Black and white women. And how has inequality of pay widened between Black and white women? Now, if you can answer those questions first, these reading comprehension questions, which are the author's questions, become easier because it sets you up with the facts to be able to answer them, right? And so one of your individual activities this week is going to be an essay test. It's these 4 questions. I'm going to choose 2 and give you 2 that you will have 20 minutes to answer. So I recommend just going ahead and trying to answer these written down. And therefore, when you go in to take the test, you can just take and copy and paste your answers that you've already done. I'm not changing the questions. I'm just going to give you 2 out of the 4, but you won't know which 2. But these, as you can see, these questions are more in depth. They have a higher cognitive level that they're asking you of than the questions that I ask you. I tend to try to simplify the wording and get you to talk about and understand the connections, but I don't usually ask you to make a more advanced cognitive analysis. But this is important to be able to do, right? So in number 4, for example, we talk about sociological imagination. First, you need to understand what sociological imagination is and how it works. And then you need to be able to apply it to this article to be able to answer this question. Now, sociological imagination in and of itself is an extremely complicated theory or concept. It has a lot of components, which is why I say that. It's not complicated to understand, but it has a lot of pieces that go with it, which is why the author here, Franklin, asks you to think about the micro, the macro, the social and cultural forces that have contributed to the sometimes divergent experiences, right? So they're asking you to talk about macro and micro, how that impacts society and how society impacts you, right? So it's quite the in-depth conversation. And then these are your discussion questions. At this point, I would like you to try to answer them one more time. And you'll see from the beginning to the end how your answers change. And this should be able to help you as well as you're taking exams and stuff, because you can see how you're learning from the lectures, and you can also see what you've missed. So it's what's revolutionary about marriage, how did freedom of slavery enable Black women and men to capitalize on marriage, family, and church, how did the Club Women's Movement help Black women, what were the cultural differences, and what was the pay change.